Hi, and welcome back to Gavin Sonex B. Well, the hair is back, so Russell, here it is in its full glory today, just for you. Anthony, you're absolutely right. Really, if I was going to be a stickler for the build, I would have had the valves out and given them a bit of a grind or lapping in a little bit, but as I said at the beginning of this series of videos about building this engine, I'm going to follow the instructions and I'm going to do exactly what they tell you to do, and we'll see how it works out at the end. I will be checking the compression on all the cylinders prior to starting it up, and obviously during the running in period. So if there isn't any issues with the valves, I'll let you know. But we'll see. So today I've been having a look at the push rods and the rockers, and I'll just turn the camera around for you. I've got the rockers installed on one side, and what you have to do first is temporarily put them in and check the alignment of the tappets with the top of the valves. And the idea is to shim to get the little foot on the end of the rocker to sit nicely on top of the valve, but not in the middle. It needs to be off center slightly, so that as it operates the valve, it causes the valve to rotate slightly. I've done this, and actually the shims in between the rockers proved to be absolutely fine, so I haven't had to change those at all. And I started off with 2 shims underneath the mounting points here, and actually I've taken one out, so I've got 1 shim in there to move the tappet slightly down the valve stem as you look at it, because it was a little bit too high, and you don't want them to go off the top, off to one, overlapping the side. So I've taken 1 shim out, and that's brought it back into the flat area on the top of the valve stem. So that's all good there. That didn't take too much. Now I'm using this tappet to measure the length of the push rods, and I've got in here, I don't know whether you can see it, but I have the adjustable push rod tool in there at the moment, and this is basically a special push rod which has an adjustable end on it. It screws in and out, and this is to allow you to effectively measure the length that the push rods need to be. So I've rotated the engine until the cam on that particular push rod is at its lowest, so that the push rod is as far into the head as it'll go, and then adjusted the tappet here for about one complete turn out to give us some adjustment, and locked it off there. And then I've adjusted the adjustable push rod until we've got absolutely no play there at all. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unbolt that, take the rockers off, and measure the length of the push rod, and then we've got to do a bit of a calculation to work out how to cut the real push rods. So I'm going to busy away and do that, and I'll report back shortly. So after taking it apart, I have ascertained that this end to end is 281 millimeters. That's the closest I can get, really. So it's 281 millimeters, and off of that we have to take, let's get it in focus, there we go. I don't know whether it is in focus. Well, there we go. This is the ball end that inserts into the end of the push rod. It has one already fitted, and the other end you need to trim and then insert this into. So the bit that sticks out from the back of this lip here to the end of the ball is 10 millimeters, pretty much spot on. So if the overall length is 281 millimeters, it means we need to cut the rest of our push rod to 271 millimeters. Then when we insert this into the end, it will add the 10 millimeters back on. So what I did was, this is one of the push rods that you have to trim off. It was about 10 millimeters longer than this, or half an inch or something like that. I didn't actually measure it, but I measured along it from the ball end to where the tape finishes is 271 millimeters. So I basically cut it off with a little bit to spare, a millimeter or so, and then used my what do you call that? Oh, I can't remember what they're called, but it's an abrasive wheel anyway, a mildly abrasive wheel, to shine the end up and get it absolutely spot on, perfect, and at a nice right angle end to it. So now I'm going to insert the end into it, which basically you have to heat the end of the tube up with a hot air gun, not a flame, and then insert the end in, let it cool down, and then we're going to try it and see whether it's right. I hope you're watching, Mark. So there we have it. I've heated up the end and pressed it in, given it a tap with the rubber mallet just to get it in seated, and as you can see, I'm quite happy with that. It's a good fit all the way round. So fingers crossed, let's see whether it fits. Well, success, I think. I've put the push rod in, and it's probably about 0.5 millimeter longer than I wanted it, but to cut it that accurately is fairly difficult. It's difficult to measure the length of it, let alone cut it to the length. But I've got plenty of adjustment on the tappet there, and I've just rotated the engine and watched it push the valve all the way in and back out again, and we've got a tiny little bit of gap there that I put in just to test it, and it all seems good. So I'm happy with that, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it out of there and check it in this one, just to make sure that there isn't some kind of anomaly along the length of this thing, and if it's good in this one as well, I will cut the other three to the same length, and We have to repeat the entire process for the other side because it could be a different dimension. It's unlikely to be a different dimension, but it could be. So that's all for this evening, and I shall carry on with this tomorrow, because tonight Katie and I are meeting up with some friends and we're going out to the casino in Jonzac, and we're going to have a meal, and there's a magician as well, so we have a meal and there's a magic act to keep us entertained as well. Ideal. Anyway, more tomorrow. So when I said more tomorrow, what I actually meant was more in about a month's time, because things didn't work out that way. I'm going to give you a quick resume of what happened, and again, Mark, I hope you're watching, because this vindicates everything that happened to you. Anyway, last time, a month ago, I had cut one of the push rods, and everything seemed to be good. So based on that, I cut the other 3 for that side of the engine to exactly the same length, within as what I could measure it anyway, and assembled those together, and everything was good. Absolutely everything was fine. They all went in okay. I had plenty of adjustment on each of the adjusters on the tappets, and I thought, yes, I've cracked it. But I was wrong, because then I went and did the other side of the engine. I followed the same process. So I measured one. Well, I assembled the rocker onto, or the rocker assembly onto the top of the head, and in doing that, needed to check the alignment of the tappets against the top of each of the valves, and on that side they didn't line up very well, and a couple of them were overlapping the edge of the valve stems. So I then got the bag of shims that are provided, and shimmed them. I had to, actually I'll show you if I walk around here. Now the engine has moved, it's no longer on the mezzanine because it became too heavy. And so I got a friend round and we walked it down the stairs, and it's now on the kitchen table, and it's been here for about 3 weeks now. But that's another story. Luckily, I have a wife who's very tolerant of me doing stuff like this, and we've been eating on the other end of the table with an engine sat on one end. Anyway, back to the story. So if I turn the camera around, on the second side, I had to align these tappets with the valve stems, and they were quite a reasonable amount out. So I ended up with I think it's 1 shim underneath the mountings, the same as the other side, but then I had to try and work out how to reshim the bar itself to get the rockers to line up with the valve stems correctly. So in order to do that, there was no combination of the shims that would work, because this part here was causing a problem. So I had to, I don't think it was this side actually, I think it was the other side, but anyway, what I had to do was basically take the whole thing apart, take a little tiny bit off the end of this spacer tube in the center here. It's just a tube, in order to allow me to use a thicker shim to get everything to line up, because this was basically stopping me being able to adjust them properly. So I did that, and with a combination of shims and cutting this one down or just reducing it down slightly, everything then lined up perfectly. So I then went through the same procedure as I did before, and I used this one here to measure the length of the push rod. It came out somewhere very similar to the other side, and I went and cut that and tested it in there and thought, yes, that's all right. So I went ahead and cut all the others, and that was my mistake, because I didn't bother to recheck the one I'd cut into any of the other positions before cutting the other three. If I had, I would have realized that they were all different lengths. And I then spent about 2 days trying to work out why this had happened. And to cut a very, very, very long story short, the only difference between one side and the other side is that on the first side I didn't have to reshim the rockers, so they were in their default locations, and on the second side I did have to reshim them. And the only explanation I could come up with is that when you reshim the rockers and you move them slightly, and I mean it is a very small amount, it's enough, or that the small distance that you've moved them is multiplied up by the action of the rocker themselves. So a small movement in the horizontal direction produces a large gap at the tappet position. And so the best advice I can give you is to measure every single one individually when you come to do this, because you cannot rely on just measuring one and then cutting them all the same length. You need to measure every single one. And so Mark, I believe you had to move all your rockers left and right, and had a lot of trouble getting them lined up, and that's probably why all your push rods were different lengths. So I learned something. It means that the instructions are not complete, and could do with a bit of updating, because it is best to measure every single one individually and then cut them to length. So that's my little bit of news on that. Since then, I've been waiting for the new push rods to arrive from Sonex, and so it's taken a few weeks to order them and get them to arrive. And in the meantime, I've done some prettying up operations. So I've fitted the air intakes, and I've fitted all the little plates around the outside that fill in all the holes. There's the one with the temperature sender on it, oil temperature that is, and the dipstick, and I've also fitted the oil cooler, the top mount oil cooler on top. I have torqued up the bolt on the front of the prop hub, and I have torqued up the nut on the back of the flywheel. Now, for all those who don't know, this nut has to be torqued to 308 Newton meters. I don't know what it is in pounds feet, but it's a lot. And with a standard torque wrench that you'd normally use for motor mechanic work, they don't go up that high. The one I had went up to about 210 Newton meters. And I say you need to go up to 308. Now the only way of doing that is to buy a much bigger torque wrench, and also really at that sort of torque you need a high impact socket as well. So that's exactly what I did. I had to order a huge torque wrench. They go up really big. So just a second. There's the high impact socket, and it's a 3/4 drive. Don't use a half drive, you'll just ring it off. And then behind here is the torque wrench itself, which is massive. It's nearly 1 meter long, but it was very easy to do the nut up and torque it up, and it was perfect. So that's about where I am with the engine at the moment. The push rods arrived a few days ago, and I'm about to go through the entire process again of measuring them and cutting them. The new ones that have been supplied, I think, are the uprated version. There's 2 different wall thicknesses of the tubes, and these ones look like the 50 thou ones rather than the 32 thou walls. I haven't actually checked them, but they look thicker. So that's good, because an uprated version is probably a good thing. Can't hurt, might add a little bit of weight, but certainly can't hurt. And so I am at the point where I can now carry on with assembling the engine, and that's what I'm going to do. So the next things to do are basically concentrate on the rear end here. I want to get the alternator fitted inside, and the plate that goes, the mounting plate that goes on the back, the accessory plate I think they call it, and then there's the magnetos which go on the accessory plate, and then there's the pickup for the coil ignition, goes in the center here somewhere. And once I've done that, then I'll be moving the engine out into the garage and putting it on the front of the aircraft. Woohoo! Now, I've been doing some work on the brakes as well, and I'll tell you about that a little later on. But for me, for the moment, see you later.